Hello, in this video we are going to look at this coding map problem called Unlucky 1 in Arrays 1. So let's start by reading the problem. We'll say that a 1 immediately followed by a 3 in an array is an unlucky 1. Return true if the given array contains an unlucky 1 in the first two or last two positions of the array. So let's look at the examples they give us. So in this example, unlucky 1 has been passed an array of length 4 and it returns true. So let's look at why that is. So we look at the first element, and that's a 1. And then so we want to check if it's unlucky, so we're going to check the element right next to it, which is a 3. And sure enough, that's unlucky. So we return true. Let's look at the second case. In this case, we've passed the method an array of length 5. And so we're going to start. Let's check the first element. That's not a 1, so I don't need to check if it's unlucky or not. I'm going to check the second element. That's a 1. So let's see if it's unlucky. And to do that, I check the next element, which is a 3. And sure enough, this is an unlucky 1, so I return true. Let's check the last situation. So I check the first element. That's a 1, so we have to see if it's unlucky. And we check the next element. It's not a 3, so it's not unlucky. So we check the second element in the array. That's a 1. So let's check the next one. It's not a 3, so it's not unlucky. And now we need to check the last two elements of the array. So because this is a length of 3, there's a bit of overlap. So we're going to check the second last element. That's a 1. Now let's check the next element. Is that a 3? No, so it's not unlucky. And now I don't actually have to check the last element because it can't be unlucky because the following, there's no 3 after it. So what this means is that there are 3 situations to check. Case 1 is the first element. Case 2 is the second element. And case 3 is the third element. Sorry, not the third element, the second last element. Now, if we take a look at this method header, let's make sure we understand it. We see that it returns a Boolean. It's called unlucky 1. And it takes an array of integers. If I hit go just with nothing in there, I get an error. And what the error is saying is basically, you're telling me I should be returning a Boolean, but I'm not returning anything. So this is the type of situation that if any of these cases are true, we return true. If the first element is unlucky, we return true. If the second element is unlucky, we return true. And if the second last element is unlucky, we return true. So what we're going to do is inspect each of these cases. And then if they all aren't true, we return false. So if I just put a return false at the bottom here, we see that some of my cases work. Perfect. All right. So let's set up case 1. Now, before I begin, what I'm going to do, and I like to do this whenever I'm working with problems like this, is I always like to make an integer called length, and I like to store nums.length. I like to actually have the length of the length of the array inside a variable. It just makes it a little easier to deal with. And I'm going to put that up there. So case 1. So case 1 is if nums at 0 is equivalent to 1, and nums at 1 is equivalent to 3. So now if the first element is a 1 and the second element is a 3, that's unlucky, so we return true. So now let's make our second case. Now our second case can be an else if, because if we go into this conditional statement, we're done. We hit a return statement, we stop. So let's make this an else if nums at 1 is equivalent to 1 and nums at 2 is equivalent to 3. We're going to return true. And finally, let's look at case 3, else if. Now here's the tricky part. How do I check the second last element? So the second last element in our first example would be this number 4. So if we think about the length of this array is 4, and the index of the 4 is 2, right? 0, 1, 2. So we see that we can get the 2 by taking the length minus 2. So let's confirm that in the second case. So in this case, we want to inspect the second last element, which is here. And we know the length of this is 5, and the index position is 0, 1, 2, 3. And 5 minus 2 is 3. So what we're going to do is we're going to say else if nums at the length, len, which is, remember we stored the length of nums in that variable, minus 2 is equivalent to 1, and nums at length minus 1 is equivalent to 3. This is unlucky, so we return true. Now I'm going to hit go, and it's going to work for some cases, and I hope you've identified that there are some situations that are going to fail. So let's take a look at what those are. So I hit go, I come over, oh look at that, that's pretty good. And here are my 2 errors. And these tell me something. Say array index out of bounds exception. What that means is that I'm trying to access an element in the array that doesn't exist. And that crashes the program. This is called a runtime error, because what's happening is it says grab index 6. Well, there's no index 6, so it crashes. So how do we deal with that? Well, we could do a number of different things, but what I like to do is I like to put a length check at the start of my if statement. So remember, when I have a bunch of AND operators, as soon as it fails one, it doesn't check the rest. So if I put here if, we're only going to check this if if length is greater than 2. Because in order for this to work, I have to have 2 elements in order to check these 2. And again, this works because if this is false, Java doesn't bother checking the other 2 conditions. Well, when is this going to work? This is only going to work if length is greater than 2. Well, this would only work not if length is greater than 3, right? Because if length is greater than 3, this is going to be the second element, and this is going to be the third element, right? We need to have 3 elements for this one to work. And then finally, when is this going to work? Well, this is only going to work if if length is greater than, so let's come up here. Well, if the length is 2, we can subtract. We could have a length of 2 where it's going to be those 2 elements. So this is going to work provided that the length is greater than or equal to 2. Actually, this should be greater than or equal to 2. And this should be greater than or equal to 3. And I hit go. There goes all my array index out of bounds error. So this is actually a really nice little trick to highlight. You could do this length check before you do this if statement, but if you do the length check at the start inside the if statement, is if this fails, it doesn't bother checking the rest. Notice, if I take this length check and I put it at the end here and I say and length is greater than or equal to 2, and I give this a go, you'll see that I'll still get some index out of bounds errors. And the reason why I'm still getting index out of bounds errors is because the first thing it checks is this. When I evaluate this if statement, I go from left to right. So it evaluates this, and that is actually, that's an index out of bounds error. So it's really important to kind of understand that, or just use as a general rule, is that if you have to check the length of any type of array, and in fact a string as well, we always check the length is greater, the length at the start of the conditional statement. I hope this helped, and as always, please don't hesitate to ask any questions.